Welcome to Island Crimes and Mysteries. And now, it's time to join your host Nules for another episode.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. I want to thank you for joining me today, and if you're a returning listener, I want to say a big thank you for your continued support. If this is your first time listening to my podcast, welcome. It's great to have you on board. So without further ado, let's get started on today's story. Today's case takes us to the island of Ireland's Eye. This is an uninhabited island that lies approximately 15 minutes by boat off the east coast of Ireland. The island was not always uninhabited though. Around 700 AD, 3 monks who happened to be sons of a prince of the Royal House of Leinster established a church on the island called Kilmachnassan Church. They would create a holy manuscript copy of the 4 Gospels called the Garland of Hoth, and this is now preserved in Trinity College. Some of the structure still remains on the island, but the majority of it was destroyed by Viking invasions in the 9th and 10th century. Come the 13th century, all monastic activities on the island moved to the mainland. Then in 1803, a tower called the Martello Tower was built on the island, as well as 2 more on the mainland by the then Duke of York. These imposing structures were built in the hope they would repel any possible invasion by Napoleon. Today you can take a ferry to the island and explore the remains of these structures and view an amazing natural structure called the Stack, which is a huge freestanding rock where you will find various breeds of birds taking shelter, from gulls to gannets. The island is also home to puffins and seals and an array of other wildlife. So if you love nature, there is a treasure trove of it to be seen on the island. But apart from all the history and wildlife on the island, an infamous occurrence that took place on Ireland's Eye in September of 1852 is what the island is best known for. A man named William Burke Kirwan was charged with the murder of his wife, Sarah Maria Louisa Crowe. This story proved controversial at the time and still remains so to this day. Was Sarah's death an accident, or did William actually kill her? I'm going to tell you their story and you can decide what you actually think happened. William was born in Dublin in 1814 into a wealthy upper-class family. His father Patrick was an art dealer. So William enjoyed a very privileged upbringing, attending the best private schools and doing really well at school. As he got into his teens, it became apparent that, like his father Patrick, William had an eye for art and was actually becoming a talented artist in his own right. He would go on to study under the acclaimed portrait artist Richard Downes Boyer. And in 1836, when William was just 22 years old, he had his art displayed at the Royal Hibernian Academy, where it would remain on display for a whole decade. Along with his artwork, William was a skilled engraver as well as working with surgeons as an anatomical draftsman. This was an artist who made drawings of the human body from watching surgeons do human dissections in a time when the medical world was learning about the human body and how it worked. One artist of note famous for his anatomical drawing was Leonardo da Vinci. In 1840, William met Sarah, who actually went by her middle name Maria to those who knew her, and they would go on to marry. Sarah, then 21, born in 1824, was the daughter of James, a lieutenant, and Maria Crowe. They were another upper-class family, and she was the eldest of 4 children. Sarah was renowned for her natural beauty and was in demand by her many suitors. She was not short of attention. William had to work fast to ensure her hand. It did, of course, help that by now William was a well-established, well-known artist and was making a substantial amount of money from his work along the way. This gave him the upper hand when it came to securing an engagement to Sarah. Both families were very happy, as the 2 wealthy families would be connected now through marriage. They would, after getting married, move to an affluent area of Dublin, settling at number 11 Miriam Square. They were very popular in society circles in Dublin. People said the couple always seemed happy. Sarah being described as a lovely, kind person. William continued working as an artist while Sarah stayed at home and ran the household. She would also arrange any social gatherings the couple would have at their home. By June of 1852, the couple had been married for 12 years, but they had no children. They had decided to holiday in Howth that year and would stay at the lodgings of a Mrs. Power. Howth is a seaside village about 40 minutes from Dublin City. It's where James Joyce's book Ulysses is immortalised and was a place for the wealthy of the time to holiday and get away from city life. As it was an escape for city dwellers, William and Sarah would know a lot of people also holidaying there as the upper class descended on the small fishing village. Most families would give the entire summer there. While there, William would relax and paint, and Sarah, who loved to sea swim and bathe in the sea, would take advantage of being near the coast and swim every day. She was known as a strong swimmer, but was also said to be a bit of a daredevil, sometimes going out further than she should have, or that was deemed safe, and even jumping from cliff edges into the sea. Looking in from the outside, their lives seemed perfect. But as we all know, not everything is always as it seems. William had a secret, a big secret he was keeping from his wife and everyone else. He was leading a double life. For 10 of the 12 years William was married to Sarah, he had been keeping a mistress in a holiday home he owned in Sandymount in Dublin. A home Sarah allegedly knew nothing about. Her name was Teresa Kenny, and together they had 7 children. Sarah did not know about the existence of this other family, and whether Teresa knew about Sarah is unknown. William looked after his second family very well, and they wanted for nothing. They had servants, the children were well educated, they had a good life. William would spend 3 nights a week with his second family every week, telling Sarah he had to work away for those 3 nights, which he continued to do even while holidaying with his wife in Howth. That summer had been particularly wet, so days where they could take a boat out to the island were slim. And as the summer ebbed away, it was looking unlikely they would get out to the island at all, where Sarah loved to swim at some of the quiet beaches there, and William loved to paint the horizon as the sun would be setting. They would always look for the quietest parts of the island to spend their days. Monday the 6th of September was a warm, balmy day, the first in a long time, and William and Sarah decided it was the perfect day to go out to Ireland's Eye. They gathered what they needed to bring with them, which included a carpet bag with Sarah's bathing dress, food provisions in a basket, and 2 bottles of water, and of course William's sketchbook. The boat dropped them off to the island at around 10 a.m, and they arranged to have the boat come back and collect them to bring them to the mainland at 8 p.m. Another couple, the Brews, arrived sometime later and met William and Sarah on the island. They were returning at 4 p.m, and Mrs. Brew offered Sarah a lift back on her boat, but she declined. Once the Brews left at 4 p.m, William and Sarah would be alone on the island until their boat would collect them at 8 p.m. About 45 minutes before the boat set out on its trip back to the island to collect the Kerwins, several people claimed to have heard a woman's screams coming from the island, carried by the breeze across the harbour. A man called Thomas Larkin, who was on another boat that day, was returning into the harbour around 7 p.m. after a day's fishing and had passed very close to the island. He claimed he heard the screams of a woman coming from an area of the island known as the Long Hole. But for whatever reason, the boat continued on back to the harbour, and they did not check if someone was in trouble. Several other people in Howth would also claim to have heard these screams coming from the island in or around 7 p.m, and would later testify to that fact. When the boat containing 4 men on board named Patrick Nagle, his cousin Michael Nagle, Thomas Stiles and Edward Campbell arrived to collect the Kerwins, they found William alone on a high rock overlooking the landing place. He claimed very calmly, according to the boatman, he had not seen his wife since 6 p.m, when she had left his company, saying she told him she was going to go for a swim at the Long Hole. The men were surprised to hear she would even dare to go swimming at that part of the island. The Long Hole was a particularly dangerous part of the island. No one would swim there normally. It was very rocky with very dangerous currents. So the men began to search the island with haste for Sarah, when one of the men saw something white in the distance. As he approached, he realised it was a body lying on a rock in the middle of the Long Hole. It was Sarah. She was lying on the rock with her swimsuit up around her neck. Patrick Nagle approached Sarah, and the first thing he noticed was the amount of bruising she had all over her body, as well as on her face. She also had blood coming out of her ears. When William arrived at the scene, he rushed towards her and threw himself on her body, shouting, "Maria, Maria!" Patrick Nagle would later testify that William asked him to go get her clothes from a nearby area of rock that Sarah had supposedly set up a little picnic area earlier. But Patrick wasn't able to find the clothes. He returned and told William, who said, "I will go myself." After a short time, he returned and told Patrick to go back to the nearby rocks and he would find the clothes. Patrick was sure he had already searched that area twice and there was no clothes there when he did. He returned with the clothes and he and the other boatman went back to the boat to try and manoeuvre it around to the treacherous long hole to retrieve her body, leaving William alone with her while they did. They wrapped Sarah's body in a sail and placed her in the boat, and they rowed back to the harbour in Howth and alerted the authorities. Her remains were taken back to a Mrs. Campbell's house by dray, and the following morning an inquest was held, with the two Nagles and William present, where a medical student named Hamilton, after hearing the evidence and examining Sarah's remains, returned a verdict of found drowned, stating there was water in her lungs. It all initially seemed very straightforward. Sarah had went swimming in an area of the island that was notoriously dangerous and everybody knew that, and she drowned. End of story, right? Wrong. After her funeral and subsequent interment at Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin, whispers were starting about the exact circumstances surrounding Sarah's unfortunate demise. People who knew Sarah well were unconvinced she would deliberately put herself in harm's way by swimming in such a dangerous place with no chance of help if she got into any difficulty. Although Sarah was known for her daredevil adventures, people were unconvinced she would be this reckless. People were also not happy with the fact that it was a medical student who had examined Sarah at the inquest and returned the verdict of found drowned. Plus, it did not help alleviate suspicion when William, only a few weeks after his wife's death, moved Teresa Kenny and their 7 children into 11 Miriam Square. This outraged the locals, who had a very high moral compass in keeping with the Victorian times they lived in. As the whispers began to grow and the witnesses to the screams that night came forward, the authorities could no longer ignore the fact that William had both a very good motive and definitely had the opportunity that day to kill his wife. Sarah's body was exhumed a month after burial and was examined this time by a medical examiner with over 30 years' experience. He would conclude that Sarah was indeed murdered and that the bruises were defensive wounds, before concluding that Sarah had died by strangulation. But he gave no evidence to back up how he came to this conclusion of death by strangulation. William Kerwin was promptly arrested for his wife's murder and sent to jail to await trial. The rumours and speculation only grew in that intervening time between when William was arrested and when his trial would begin on the 8th of December 1852. He was defended by Isaac Butt, whom a lot of you will remember from your history classes at school. Butt is regarded as the founder of the Home Rule movement in Ireland. He was a politician and lawyer and was a member of the Irish and British Bar. He would enter Parliament that same year of 1852 as a Liberal Conservative. He fought for land tenure reform, defending the Fenian leaders, and in 1870 founded the Home Rule Society, where he would remain leader until his death in 1879. Charles Stewart Parnell would take over from him. So to say William's defence was distinguished would be an understatement. On the day the trial was due to begin, crowds thronged the streets around the courthouse in Dublin, long before the judges had even arrived. Inside the courthouse, all seats were full between curious people and press. The impending case had become a sensation. Victorian apathy for immorality meant the focus of the general public was more on William's indiscretions than the actual alleged murder itself. So every day for the duration of the trial, the courthouse would be packed and newspapers would sell out as people lapped up every detail of the day's events. That first day, William would be summoned to the dock not long after 10 a.m. by the Clerk of the Crown. People clamoured forward in the courthouse for their seats to catch a first glimpse of the accused. William's demeanour was described as firm and collected. Described as a good-looking man around 30 years old with dark hair and eyes, dressed in a tight-fitting topcoat of fine black cloth, He wore a black satin stock and black kidskin gloves. When called, he presented himself in front of the dock and leant forward on the bar. When the indictment was read out to him that on the 6th of September he had murdered his wife, Sarah Maria Louisa Crowe Kirwan, William's demeanour remained calm and collected, and this is how he would present himself for the duration of the trial. 2 judges would preside over the proceedings, with a Mr. Smiley QC heading the prosecution, and as already mentioned, Mr. Isaac Butt QC heading the defence. The case would rest on 2 points. One, for the prosecution being his double life and secret family were motive enough for William to kill his wife, and 2, for the defence that Sarah had died from an epileptic seizure caused by entering the water with a full stomach. Mr. Smiley gave the defence's opening statements. It would be proved to the satisfaction of the jury that, though the prisoner had been married to a woman 12 years ago, during the whole of that period he lived with another female by whom he had a family of 7 children. The prisoner during each day had occupied in his profession of artist and anatomical draftsman, but a great part of his time was spent at Sandymount with Teresa Kenny, the female already alluded to, and the business was so well managed that it was not until the last 6 months that either of those women knew that the other had a claim on his attention. Mrs. Kerwin believed that she was the sole possessor of his attention, and Miss Kenny had the same belief up to a recent period. The prosecution would go on to attack Teresa Kenny's character throughout the trial, making the jury ask the questions: had William grown tired of his marriage to Sarah? Did he want her out of the picture so he could move his mistress and 7 children into the house, marry her and live as a family? Had Teresa encouraged William to leave his wife or to get rid of her? The only person in the way, after all, was Sarah. The prosecution presented a strong circumstantial case. The landlady of the lodging house the Kerwins had stayed in Howth took the stand. She said they came to lodge with her in June. They had occupied 1 room, used a sitting room and a bedroom. She said Mr. Kerwin would not sleep there every night, only about 3 nights a week. He would go into the city during the day, returning at about 5 p.m, or other times he would get the last train. She would say that she did hear them arguing on 1 occasion, Mr. Kerwin being the aggressor, calling Sarah names and telling her he would finish her. She said she would hear Sarah saying, "Let me alone," with the witness saying that the following morning Sarah was black and blue. She said she never heard any arguments other than that one time and had always thought they were a happy couple up until then. She said the night Sarah's body was brought back, William had stayed in the house. She hadn't noticed anything unusual about him apart from the fact he said his feet were wet. She helped him change his stockings. Then Patrick Nagle took the stand. He was one of the boatmen that had found Sarah at the Long Hole. He said that when he brought them to Ireland's Eye in the boat that day, they had a bag and 2 bottles of water. He said Sarah had another bag as well, and Mr. Kerwin had a slick stick. When asked what that was, he said a cane with a sword in it. Patrick described the search for and the finding of the body as already described. He said Mrs. Kerwin had her bathing shift on. It had gathered up around her waist, leaving the rest of her person exposed. There was a sheet under her back, and the sheet was wet, and so was her bathing shift. Her head was laying right between 2 little rocks. Her feet were lying in a little pool or hollow containing about ½ gallon of water. Patrick said he inspected her face and person as well as he could. There was a cut under her right eye and scratches on her cheek and a cut upon her forehead. The cuts were such as might have been made by a pin or some sharp instrument, he said. Blood was flowing from the cuts as well as her ears. He said he stooped down and tied the sheet, which was under the deceased, around the neck of the body and folded the other end around her feet. He spoke about Mr. Kerwin coming up and throwing himself on the body and calling out, "Oh, Maria, Maria." Mr. Kerwin, he said, then told Patrick to go and look for the clothes, and he did so, and he couldn't find them. Patrick, now under oath, swore that the clothes were not in the place that William had said they were when he searched, and were there afterwards. He spoke about when he came back from his unsuccessful search that Mr. Kerwin had rose up from the body and went to seek the clothes, and came back a few minutes later and told Patrick they were on top of the rock. Patrick then went back and found the clothes. The clothes were neatly arranged, just as if she had taken them off. The stockings were folded together. He said there were bathing shoes on her feet when Sarah's body was found. On cross-examination, Patrick said that William almost lost his life during the search. He said Mr. Kerwin was very near being killed himself that evening when the body was found. If I'd not called and caught him, he would have gone over the rock. If he had taken one step further, he would certainly have been killed. A horse would have been killed if they'd fell from those rocks, he said. He then admitted he did not know whether the stick Mr. Kerwin carried was a slick stick or not. It was the stick he always carried, he said. His cousin Michael Nagle was then examined by the prosecution and also described the search and the finding of the body. Mr. Kerwin went over, he said, and threw himself down on the body and began to moan and cry. He said then he rose up and asked them to go and look for the clothes. Michael took the Strand way. Neither he nor Patrick Nagle found the clothes. When they came back, Mr. Kerwin rose from the body and went up to the rock. Soon after, Michael heard Mr. Kerwin say, "Here they are," and then saw Mr. Kerwin coming down, bringing something white in his hand. It was a shawl. He then told Pat Nagle to go for the clothes, he said. On cross-examination by Mr. Butt, Michael swore he saw Mr. Kerwin bringing back something like a shawl. Something white, he said, like a sheet. Mr. Brew, who had been on the island that day with his wife, swore to his wife's invitation to Mrs. Kerwin to return with her earlier in the day. He said Mr. Kerwin was then engaged in sketching an old ruin. Another witness, a Mr. Henry Campbell, swore he lived in Howth and on the evening the body was found heard cries from Ireland's Eye. Henry said he heard 3 cries. He could not distinguish any words. The second cry was about 3 minutes after the first and the third shortly after that. Thomas Larkin, the fisherman returning in a boat that evening close to Ireland's Eye, heard cries when halfway between Martello Tower and the bay. He told Mr. Butt there was about 5 or 6 minutes between the first and the second cries. Several other witnesses deposed to hearing the screams. Another witness, Mr. Bridgeford, who lived in Sandymount, said, Mr. Kerwin lived in one of the 4 houses in Spafield, of which I am the landlord. He resided there for about 4 years. I saw a woman there whom I always supposed to be his wife. I saw children in the house too. I have notes from the woman and I think she signed herself Teresa. A lady called Catherine Byrne, who worked at William's house in Sandymount, gave evidence saying, I have lived with William and Teresa at Sandymount as a servant. Mrs. Kerwin lived there. There were 7 children in the house. Mr. Kerwin used to be there a good deal in the daytime. He slept there with Mrs. Kerwin frequently at night. Her name was Teresa Mary Frances Kenny. She obviously assumed they were married. Mr. Hamilton, the medical student who made the examination at the inquest the day after Sarah's body was found, said that there was no marks on the body that arrested his attention when he examined her, and that the water was present in her lungs, indicating drowning. Then George Hatchell, MD and surgeon, was called to give his evidence to the examination of the body he carried out when it had been exhumed from Glasnevin 31 days after her death. He said the season had been very wet and there had been about 2 feet of water in the grave. The body was badly decomposed and for that reason he discovered no internal or external trace of violence. When asked by Mr. Smiley, from the appearance of the body, can you, as a medical man, form an opinion as to the cause of death? To which Mr. Hatchell replied, I am of the opinion death was caused by asphyxia or stoppage of the respiration. From the appearance of the body, I should say that stoppage of respiration was combined with pressure or constriction of some kind. When asked if it could be simple drowning that would have caused such an appearance, he replied, not to the same extent. Dr. Hatchell was then cross-examined at length by Mr. Butt. He admitted that the appearance of the bruising and markings might have been caused by the lady making efforts to save herself from drowning. He had been told of instruments having been run through the body, but could not find any trace of that. Going into the water with a full stomach would likely cause a fit, he said. Mr. Butt then asked, "Do I understand you to say that the appearance presented were consistent with that of a person with a full stomach going into the water?" To which Dr. Hatchell replied, "It could be probable." When asked, "Is it not probable that such was the cause of death?" he said, "I am not prepared to say whether it was or not." "From your knowledge as a medical man, is it not probable?" Mr. Butt persisted. "Have you heard of a fit of epilepsy being caused by a person going into the water with a full stomach?" Dr. Hatchell answered, "It is possible. I have heard of persons falling in a fit of epilepsy, giving one loud scream. I never heard more than one scream though frequent screams are not impossible." Finally, Henry Davis, the coroner who had held the inquest the day after Sarah's death, was called. In reply on cross-examination, he said he had been the coroner for 12 years. He had seen bodies that had been bitten by crabs, he said. The marks on the eyelids were like those marks. So were all the markings on Sarah's body from struggling to get out of the water and her body being attacked by marine life after she drowned? Or had they come from William as she fought for her life as he attacked her? Mr. Butt begged the jury to banish from their mind all the rumours about the prisoner they had heard outside the court. He maintained that all the evidence was consistent with accidental drowning. He ridiculed the idea that the prisoner had first murdered the woman and then undressed her and placed her in a position in which she had been found. If the suggestion was that he had followed her into the water and held her under, then you would think his arms and his body would have been as wet as his feet. Mr. Hayes, for the prosecution, in reply to Mr. Butt's challenge, suggested to the jury the theory of the Crown as to how the murder had been committed. "Let them suppose," he said, "that the prisoner induced the deceased to bathe in the long hole. He mediated her death. It must have been about 7 o'clock when she bathed, and at that time the water was 2 feet 9 inches deep. Let it be supposed she was in this water, that the prisoner came into the hole with the sheet in his hand for the purpose of putting it over her head, that on seeing him approach in this manner, his dreadful purpose at once flashed across the mind of the victim. Might she not then have uttered the dreadful agonising shriek that was the first heard on the mainland? If he succeeded in forcing her under the water, notwithstanding her fruitless struggles with all her youthful energy against his superior strength, might they not in that respect expect the fainter, agonising and dying shrieks, which both men and women swore they heard from the mainland, growing fainter and fainter? It was for the jury to consider all the facts, and to say whether this case was not the most probable. After closing arguments had concluded, Mr. Justice Crampton, one of the 2 judges proceeding, charged the jury and they retired. But at about 20 to 8 they returned, with the foreman saying, "I don't think we are likely to agree," while another juror said there was not the remotest chance of an agreement. The judge told them it would be necessary for them to stay in the room for the night until they reached an agreement. The foreman asked the judge what would the latest hour his lordship would receive a verdict in case of an agreement. The judge told them he would return to court at 11 o'clock. He returned at 11 and the foreman said that they had still not agreed, and nor were they likely to agree. The judge then stated they had to be locked into the room for the night with no food. A juror urged the judge to wait a little bit longer, and after just half an hour more of deliberation, they returned with a verdict: guilty. At 10 a.m. the following morning, the courthouse was awash with people, all clamouring in to hear the sentence that would be handed down to William. When William arrived back into the court, he was again impeccably dressed and appeared calm and collect. William was asked if he had anything he wanted to say as to why the sentence of death should not be imposed. He protested his innocence and went on to describe the day, saying he had been sketching after his wife had left to go for a swim, as he was anxious to catch the sunset effects on the mountain, and he said he had handed this sketchbook over to the police in which he had reproduced these effects. He said his feet had gotten wet walking through the long grass as they searched for his wife. The judge interrupted him, saying all this had already been gone through in trial, before handing down a sentence of death to William, saying as he handed down the sentence, You raised your hand against a female, a hapless, unprotected female, who by the laws of God and men was entitled to your protection, even at the hazard of your own life and your affectionate guardianship. In the solitude of that rocky island to which you brought her on that fateful day of the 6th of September under the veil of approaching night, when there was no hand to stay and no human eye to see your guilt, you perpetrated this terrible, this unnatural crime. No human eye could see how this act was done. None but your own conscience and the all-seeing providence could develop this mysterious transaction. The only time William showed any emotion was when his sentence was handed down, saying, "Convinced as I am that my hopes in this world are at an end, I do most solemnly declare in the presence of this court, and before the God before whom I expect soon to stand, that I had neither act nor part nor knowledge of my late wife's death. And I state further that I never treated her unkindly, as her own mother can testify." This sentence of death would later be commuted by the Lord Lieutenant Lord Engleton to penal servitude for life. William would go on to serve 27 years on Spike Island and was released on the 3rd of March 1879 with the condition he had to live outside the British dominions. Rumours through the years say he returned to the scene of his wife's death on his release, but this could not be substantiated. It is said that he then rejoined his mistress and family and they emigrated to America, where he died in 1880. So, did William murder his wife Sarah that day on the island of Ireland's Eye? Or was it a pure accident? Did she jump into the dangerous waters at the Long Hole after eating and simply drown? I think we could safely say today that modern medicine would rule out the possibility that jumping into the water with a full stomach wouldn't induce an epileptic seizure. But it was never established at court, or from anything I read, that she did actually suffer from epilepsy. So that she had a seizure at all is up for debate. Were all the markings on her body from being submerged in the water or fighting for her life, being bashed against the rocks? Or were they defensive marks? This case is open to several differing opinions. It's a hard one to figure out. The fact that he had a second family was indeed motive. Why, after all these years, did he feel he needed to get rid of Sarah? Maybe she had just found out his secret. But why would she agree to go on a day trip to the island with her husband if she'd just found out about his double life? This case, I won't lie, had me perplexed. But however Sarah met her end, it's a sad story, and one I think that we will never know what exactly happened. So what do you think? Was William guilty or was he innocent? So guys, that's it for today's episode of the Ireland Crimes and Mysteries podcast. Again, thanks for your listenership, and don't forget to subscribe to the show and hit that auto download so you never miss an episode. Until the next time, keep your eyes open and your mind curious. This podcast has been compiled from information gathered in the public sphere, like news articles, documentaries, and open source material that can be found on the web. Everything in this podcast is alleged unless a conviction has taken place.
You've been listening to Ireland Crimes and Mysteries. Join Nules for another episode, coming real soon. And keep up to date by following our social media sites, our YouTube channel, and our website, irelandcrimesandmysteries.ie.